Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Catherine, Micah, Chris, Chloe, Joyce, and Eve. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And because you joined in the month of February, you and everyone else who supports us through Patreon or through a one-time tip on buymeacoffee.com will be entered into a raffle at the end of the month, the prize for which is an exclusive episode of Boring Books for Bedtime made just for you. You get to pick the book, and copyright restrictions do not apply. If you're interested in being part of that giveaway and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes and collections found nowhere else, you'll find links to Patreon and buymeacoffee.com in the show description. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's relax with more from a classic guide on how to treat each other respectfully. Etiquette in society, in business, in politics, and at home, by Emily Post, author of Purple and Fine Linen, The Title Market, Woven in the Tapestry, The Flight of a Moth, Letters of a Worldly Godmother, etc., etc. Illustrated with private photographs and facsimiles of social forms. First published in 1922 by Funk and Wagnalls Company, New York and London. Let's pick up right where we left off in Chapter 11, Invitations, Acceptances, and Regrets. Let's begin. Other formal invitations. All other formal invitations are engraved, never printed, on cards of thin, white matte Bristol board, either plain or plate marked, like those for wedding reception cards. Note paper, such as that used for wedding invitations, is occasionally but rarely preferred. Monograms, addresses, personal devices are not used on engraved invitations. The size of the card of invitation varies with personal preference, from 4½ to 6 inches in width, and from 3 to 4½ inches in height. The most graceful proportion is 3 units in height to 4 in width. The lettering is a matter of personal choice, but the plainer the design, the better. Scrolls and ornate trimmings are bad taste always. Punctuation is used only after each letter of the RSVP, and it is absolutely correct to use small letters for the SVP. All capitals RSVP are permissible, but fastidious people prefer capital R, lowercase svp. Invitation to a ball. The word ball is never used except in an invitation to a public one, or at least a semi-public one, such as may be given by a committee for a charity or a club, or association of some sort. For example, the committee of the Greenwood Club requests the pleasure of your company at a ball to be held in the Greenwood Clubhouse on the evening of November the 7th at 10 o'clock for the benefit of the neighborhood hospital. Tickets $5. Invitations to a private ball, no matter whether the ball is to be given in a private house or whether the hostess has engaged an entire floor of the biggest hotel in the world, announce merely that Mr. and Mrs. Somebody will be at home, and the word dancing is added almost as though it were an afterthought in the lower left corner, the words at home being slightly larger than those of the rest of the invitation. When both at and home are written with a capital letter, this is the most punctilious and formal invitation that it is possible to send. It is engraved in script usually on a card of white Bristol board, about 5½ inches wide and 3¾ of an inch high. Like the wedding invitation, it has an embossed crest without color or nothing. The precise form is Mr. and Mrs. Titherington de Poyster at home on Monday the 3rd of January at 10 o'clock, 1 East 50th Street. The favor of an answer is requested. Or Mr. and Mrs. Davis Jefferson at home on Monday the 3rd of January at 10 o'clock, Town and Country Club. Kindly send reply to 3 Mount Vernon Square. Dancing. If preferred, the above invitations may be engraved in block or shaded block type. Ball for debutante daughter. Very occasionally, an invitation is worded, Mr. and Mrs. Davis Jefferson, Miss Alice Jefferson, at home, if the daughter is a debutante and the ball is for her. But it is not strictly correct to have any names but those of the host and his wife above the words, at home. The proper form of invitation when the ball is to be given for a debutante is as follows. Mr. and Mrs. de Poyster request the pleasure of Miss Rosalie Gray's company at a dance in honor of their daughter, Miss Alice de Poyster, on Monday evening, the 3rd of January at 10 o'clock, 1 East 50th Street, RSVP. Or Mr. and Mrs. Titherington de Poyster, Miss Alice de Poyster, request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Greatlake's company on Monday evening, the 3rd of January at 10 o'clock, 1 East 50th Street. Dancing, RSVP. The form most often used by fashionable hostesses in New York and Newport is Mr. and Mrs. Gilding request the pleasure of blank company at a small dance on Monday the 1st of January at Fifth Avenue. Even if given for a debutante daughter, her name does not appear, and it is called a small dance, whether it is really small or big. The request for a reply is often omitted, since everyone is supposed to know that an answer is necessary. But if the dance or dinner or whatever the entertainment is to be is given at one address and the hostess lives at another, both addresses are always given. Mr. and Mrs. Sidney Oldname request the pleasure of blank company at a dance on Monday evening, the 6th of January, at 10 o'clock, the Fitzcherry. Kindly send response to Brook Meadows, Long Island. If the dance is given for a young friend who is not a relative, Mr. and Mrs. Old Name's invitations should request the pleasure of this person's company at a dance in honor of Miss Rosalie Gray. When and how one may ask for an invitation for a stranger. One may never ask for an invitation for oneself anywhere, and one may not ask for an invitation to a luncheon or a dinner for a stranger, but an invitation for any general entertainment may be asked for a stranger, especially for a house guest. Example: Dear Mrs. Worldly, a young cousin of mine, David Blakely from Chicago, is staying with us. May Pauline take him to your dance on Friday? If it will be inconvenient for you to include him, please do not hesitate to say so frankly. Very sincerely yours, Caroline Robinson Town. Answer: Dear Mrs. Town, I shall be delighted to have Pauline bring Mr. Blakely on the 10th. Sincerely yours, Edith Worldly. A man might write an invitation for a friend, but a very young girl should not ask for an invitation for a man or anyone, since it is more fitting that her mother ask for her. An older girl might say to Mrs. Worldly, My cousin is staying with us. May I bring him to your dance? Or if she knows Mrs. Worldly very well, she might send a message by telephone. Miss Town would like to know whether she may bring her cousin, Mr. Michigan, to Mrs. Worldly's dance. Card of General Invitation. Invitations to important entertainments are nearly always especially engraved, so that nothing is written except the name of the person invited. But for the hostess who entertains constantly, a card which is engraved in blank, so that it may serve for dinner, luncheon, dance, garden party, musical, or whatever she may care to give, is indispensable. The spacing of the model shown below, the proportion of the words, and the size of the card are especially good. The dinner invitation. The blank, which may be used only for dinner, should say, Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Jones request the pleasure of blank company at dinner on this date at 8 o'clock at 2000 Fifth Avenue. For type and spacing, follow the model on page 118. Invitations to receptions and teas. Invitations to receptions and teas differ from invitations to balls in that the cards on which they are engraved are usually somewhat smaller. The words "at home" with capital letters are changed to "will be at home" with small letters, and the time is not set at the hour. Also, except on very unusual occasions, a man's name does not appear. The name of the debutante for whom the tea is given is put under that of her mother, and sometimes under that of her sister or the bride of her brother. Mrs. James Town, Mrs. James Town, Jr., Miss Pauline Town, will be at home on Tuesday the 8th of December from 4 until 6 o'clock, 2000 Fifth Avenue. Mr. Town's name would probably appear with that of his wife if he were an artist, and the reception was given in his studio to view his pictures, or if a reception were given to meet a distinguished guest, such as a bishop or a governor, in which case, in honor of the Right Reverend William Powell, or to meet His Excellency the Governor, is at the top of the invitation. The formal invitation, which is written. When the formal invitation to dinner or lunch is written instead of engraved, note paper stamped with house or personal device is used. The wording and spacing must follow the engraved models exactly. Recalling an invitation. If for illness or other reason invitations have to be recalled, the following forms are correct. They are always printed instead of engraved, there being no time for engraving. Owing to sudden illness, Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith are obliged to recall their invitations for Tuesday the 10th of June. The form used when the invitation is postponed. Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith regret exceedingly that owing to the illness of Mrs. Smith, their dance is temporarily postponed. When a wedding is broken off after the invitations have been issued, Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Nottingham announced that the marriage of their daughter Mary Catherine and Mr. Gerald Atherton will not take place. Formal acceptance or regret. Acceptances or regrets are always written. An engraved form to be filled in is vulgar. Nothing could be in worse taste than to flaunt your popularity by announcing that it is impossible to answer your numerous invitations without the time-saving device of a printed blank. If you have a dozen or more invitations a day, if you have 100, hire a staff of secretaries if need be, but answer by hand. The formal acceptance to an invitation, whether it is to a dance, wedding breakfast, or a ball, is identical. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Lovejoy accept with pleasure Mr. and Mrs. Smith's kind invitation for dinner on Monday the 10th of December at 8 o'clock. The formula for regret. Mr. Clubwin Doe regrets extremely that a previous engagement prevents his accepting Mr. and Mrs. Smith's kind invitation for dinner on Monday the 10th of December. Or Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Carey regret that they are unable to accept Mr. and Mrs. Smith's kind invitation for dinner on Monday the 10th of December. In accepting an invitation, the day and hour must be repeated, so that in case of mistake it may be rectified and prevent one from arriving on a day when one is not expected. But in declining an invitation, it is not necessary to repeat the hour. Visiting card invitations. With the exception of invitations to house parties, dinners, and luncheons, the writing of notes is past. For an informal dance, musical, picnic, for a tea to meet a guest, or for bridge, a lady uses her ordinary visiting card. Answers to invitations written on visiting cards are always formally worded in the third person, precisely as though the invitation had been engraved. Invitations in the second person. The informal dinner and luncheon invitation is not spaced according to set words on each line, but is merely written in 2 paragraphs. Example: Dear Mrs. Smith, will you and Mr. Smith dine with us on Thursday, the 7th of January at 8 o'clock? Hoping so much for the pleasure of seeing you. Very sincerely, Caroline Robinson Town. The informal note of acceptance or regret. Dear Mrs. Town, it will give us much pleasure to dine with you on Thursday the 7th at 8 o'clock. Thanking you for your kind thought of us. Sincerely yours, Margaret Smith, Wednesday. Or, Dear Mrs. Town, my husband and I will dine with you on Thursday the 7th at 8 o'clock with greatest pleasure. Thanking you so much for thinking of us. Always sincerely, Margaret Smith. Or, Dear Mrs. Town, we are so sorry that we shall be unable to dine with you on the 7th as we have a previous engagement. With many thanks for your kindness in thinking of us. Very sincerely, Ethel Norman. Invitation to a country house. To an intimate friend. Dear Sally, will you and Jack, and the baby and nurse of course, come out the 28th, Friday, and stay for 10 days? Morning and evening trains take only 40 minutes, and it won't hurt Jack to commute for the weekdays between the 2 Sundays. I am sure the country will do you and the baby good, or at least it will do me good to have you here. With much love, affectionately, Ethel Norman. To a friend of one's daughter. Dear Mary, will you and Jim come on Friday the 1st for the worldly dance and stay over Sunday? Muriel asks me to tell you that Helen and Dick, and also Jimmy Smith, are to be here, and she particularly hopes that you will come too. The 3:20 from New York is the best train, though there is a 4:20 and a 5:16, in case Jim is not able to take the earlier one. Very sincerely, Alice Jones. Confirming a verbal invitation. Dear Helen, this note is merely to remind you that you and Dick are coming here for the worldly dance on the 6th. Mother is expecting you on the 3:20 train and will meet you here at the station. Affectionately, Muriel. Invitation to a house party at a camp. Dear Miss Strange, will you come up here on the 6th of September and stay until the 16th? It would give us all the greatest pleasure. There is a train leaving Broadway Station at 8:03 a.m., which will get you to Dustville Junction at 5 p.m., and here in time for supper. It is only fair to warn you that the camp is very primitive. We have no luxuries, but we can make you fairly comfortable if you like an outdoor life and are not too exacting. Please do not bring a maid or any clothes that the woods or weather can ruin. You will need nothing but outdoor things, walking boots if you care to walk, a bathing suit if you care to swim in the lake, and something comfortable rather than smart for evening if you care to dress for supper. But on no account bring evening or any good clothes. Hoping so much that camping appeals to you, and that we shall see you on the evening of the 6th. Very sincerely yours, Martha Kindheart. The invitation by telephone. Custom which has altered many ways and manners has taken away all opprobrium from the message by telephone, and with the exception of those of a very small minority of letter-loving hostesses, all informal invitations are sent and answered by telephone. Such messages, however, follow a prescribed form. Is this Lennox 000? Will you please ask Mr. and Mrs. Smith if they will dine with Mrs. Grantham Jones next Tuesday the 10th at 8 o'clock? Mrs. Jones' telephone number is Plaza 12 Ring 2. The answer. Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Smith regret that they will be unable to dine with Mrs. Jones on Tuesday the 10th, as they are engaged for that evening. Or, will you please tell Mrs. Jones that Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Smith are very sorry that they will be unable to dine with her next Tuesday, and thank her for asking them. Or, please tell Mrs. Jones that Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Smith will dine with her on Tuesday the 10th with pleasure. The formula is the same, whether the invitation is to dine or lunch, or play bridge or tennis, or golf, or motor, or go to a picnic. Will Mrs. Smith play bridge with Mrs. Grantham Jones this afternoon at the Country Club at 4 o'clock? Hold the wire, please. Mrs. Jones will play bridge with pleasure at 4 o'clock. In many houses, especially where there are several grown sons or daughters, a blank form is kept in the pantry on which can be written the invitation. These slips are taken to whichever member of the family has been invited, who crosses off regret or accept and hands the slip back for transmission by the butler, the parlor maid, or whoever is on duty in the pantry. If Mr. Smith and Mrs. Jones are themselves telephoning, there is no long conversation, but merely, "Mrs. Jones, is that you, Mrs. Smith, or Sarah? This is Mrs. Jones, or Alice. Will you and your husband, or John, dine with us tomorrow at 8 o'clock? Mrs. Smith, I'm so sorry we can't. We are dining with Mabel." Or, "We have people coming here." Invitations to a house party are often as not telephoned. "Hello, Ethel. This is Alice. Will you and Arthur come on the 16th for over Sunday?" "The 16th? That's Friday. We'd love to. Will you take the 3:20 train, etc." Chapter 12. The Well-Appointed House. Every house has an outward appearance to be made as presentable as possible, an interior continually to be set in order, and incessantly to be cleaned. And for those that dwell within it, there are meals to be prepared and served, linen to be laundered and mended, personal garments to be brushed and pressed, and perhaps children to be cared for. There is also a doorbell to be answered, in which manners as well as appearance come into play. Beyond these fundamental necessities, luxuries can be added indefinitely, such as splendor of architecture, of gardening, and of furnishing, with every refinement of service that executive ability can produce. With all this genuine splendor possible only to the greatest establishments, a little house can no more compete than a diamond weighing but half a carat can compete with a stone weighing 50 times as much. And this is a good simile, because the perfect little house may be represented by a corner cut from precisely the same stone, and differing therefore merely in size and value naturally, whereas the house in bad taste and improperly run may be represented by a diamond that is off color and full of flaws, or in some instances merely a piece of glass that to none but those as ignorant as its owner for a moment suggests a gem of value. A gem of a house may be no size at all, but its lines are honest, and its painting and window curtains in good taste. As for its upkeep, its path or sidewalk is beautifully neat, steps scrubbed, brasses polished, and its bell answered promptly by a trim maid with a low voice and quiet courteous manner, all of which contributes to the impression of quality, even though it in nothing suggests the luxury of a palace whose opened bronze door reveals a row of powdered footmen. But the mansion of bastard architecture and crude paint, with its brass indifferently clean, with coarse lace behind the plate glass of its golden oak door, and the bell answered at 11 in the morning by a butler in an ill-fitting dress suit and wearing a mustache, might as well be placarded, "Here lives a vulgarian who has never had an opportunity to acquire cultivation." As a matter of fact, the knowledge of how to make a house distinguished both in appearance and in service is a much higher test than presenting a distinguished appearance in oneself and acquiring presentable manners. There are any number of people who dress well and in every way appear well, but a lack of breeding is apparent as soon as you go into their houses. Their servants have not good manners. They are not properly turned out. The service is not well done, and the decorations and furnishings show lack of taste and inviting arrangement. The personality of a house is indefinable, but there never lived a lady of great cultivation and charm whose home, whether a palace, a farm cottage, or a tiny apartment, did not reflect the charm of its owner. Every visitor feels impelled to linger and is loath to go. Houses without personality are a series of rooms with furniture in them. Sometimes their lack of charm is baffling. Every article is correct and beautiful, but one has the feeling that the decorator made chalk marks, indicating the exact spot on which each piece of furniture is to stand. Other houses are filled with things of little intrinsic value, often with much that is shabby, or they are perhaps empty to the point of bareness, and yet they have that inviting atmosphere and air of unmistakable quality which is an unfailing indication of high-bred people. Becoming furniture. Suitability is the test of good taste always. The manner to the moment, the dress to the occasion, the article to the place, the furniture to the background. And yet, to combine many periods in one and commit no anachronism, to put something French, something Spanish, something Italian, and something English into an American house, and have the result the perfection of American taste, is a feat of legerdemain which has been accomplished time and again. A woman of great taste follows fashion in house furnishing just as she follows fashion in dress, in general principles only. She wears what is becoming to her own type, and she puts in her house only such articles as are becoming to it. That a quaint old-fashioned house should be filled with quaint old-fashioned pieces of furniture in size proportionate to the size of the rooms, and that rush-bottom chairs and rag carpets have no place in a marble hall need not be pointed out. But to an amazing number of persons, proportion seems to mean nothing at all. They will put a huge piece of furniture in a tiny room, so that the effect is one of painful indigestion. Or they will crowd things all into one corner, so that it seems about to capsize. Or they will spoil a really good room by the addition of senseless and inappropriately cluttering objects, in the belief that because they are valuable, they must be beautiful, regardless of suitability. Sometimes a room is marred by treasures clung to for reasons of sentiment. The blindness of sentiment. It is almost impossible for any of us to judge accurately of things which we have throughout a lifetime been accustomed to. A chair that was grandmother's, a painting father bought, the silver that has always been on the dining table, are also part of ourselves that we are sentiment blind to their defects. For instance, the portrait of a colonial officer, among others, has always hung in Mrs. Oldname's dining room. One day an art critic, whose knowledge was better than his manners, blurted out, "Will you please tell me why you have that dreadful thing in this otherwise perfect room?" Mrs. Oldname, somewhat taken aback, answered rather wonderingly, "Is it dreadful, really? I have a feeling of affection for him and his dog." The critic was merciless. "If you call a cotton flannel effigy a dog, and as for the figure, it is equally false and lifeless. It is amazing how anyone with your taste can bear looking at it." In spite of his rudeness, Mrs. Oldname saw that what he said was quite true, but not until the fact had been pointed out to her. Gradually, she grew to dislike the poor officer so much that he was finally relegated to the attic. In the same way, most of us have belongings that have always been there, or perhaps treasures that we love for some association, which are probably as bad as can be, to which habit has blinded us, though we would not have to be told of their hideousness were they seen by us in the house of another. It is not to be expected that all people can throw away every aesthetically unpleasing possession with which nearly every house 25 years ago was filled. But those whose pocketbook and sentiment will permit would add greatly to the beauty of their houses by sweeping the bad into the ash can. Far better have stoneware plates that are good in design than expensive porcelain that is horrible in decoration. The only way to determine what is good and what is horrible is to study what is good in books, in museums, or in art classes in the universities, or even by studying the magazines devoted to decorative art. Be very careful, though. Do not mistake modern eccentricities for art. There are frightful things in vogue today, flamboyant colors, grotesque, triangular, and oblique designs that cannot possibly be other than bad, because aside from striking novelty, there is nothing good about them. By no standard can a room be in good taste that looks like a perfume manufacturer's fantasy, or a design reflected in one of the distorting mirrors that are mirth provokers at county fairs. To determine an object's worth. In buying an article for a house, one might formulate for oneself a few test questions. First, is it useful? Anything that is really useful has a reason for existence. Second, has it really beauty of form and line and color? Texture is not so important. Or is it merely striking or amusing? Third, is it entirely suitable for the position it occupies? Fourth, if it were eliminated, would it be missed? Would something else look as well or better in its place? Or would its place look as well empty? A truthful answer to these questions would at least help in determining its value, since an article that failed in any of them could not be perfect. Fashion affects taste. It is bound to. We abominate Louis XIV and Empire styles at the moment, because curves and super ornamentation are out of fashion. Whether they are really bad or not, time alone can tell. At present, we are admiring plain silver, and are perhaps exacting that it be too plain. The only safe measure of what is good is to choose that which has best endured. The king and the fiddle pattern for flat silver have both been in use in houses of highest fashion ever since they were designed, so that they, among others, must have merit to have so long endured. In the same way, examples of old potteries and china and glass at present being reproduced are very likely good, because after having been for a century or more in disuse, they are again being chosen. Perhaps one might say that the second choice is proof of excellence. Service. The subject of furnishings is, however, the least part of this chapter. Appointments, meaning decoration, being of less importance, since this is not a book on architecture or decoration, than appointments meaning service. But before going into the various details of service, it might be a good moment to speak of the unreasoning indignity cast upon the honorable vocation of a servant. There is an inexplicable tendency, in this country only, for working people in general to look upon domestic service as an unworthy, if not altogether degrading vocation. The cause may perhaps be found in the fact that this same scorning public, having for the most part little opportunity to know high-class servants, who are to be found only in high-class families, take it for granted that ignorant servant girls and hired men are representative of their kind. Therefore they put upper-class servants in the same category, regardless of whether they are uncouth and illiterate, or persons of refined appearance and manner, who often have considerable cultivation, acquired not so much at school as through the constant contact with ultra-refinement of surroundings, and not infrequently through the opportunity for worldwide travel. And yet, so insistently has this obloquy of the word servant spread, that everyone sensitive to the feelings of others avoids using it, exactly as one avoids using the word cripple when speaking to one who is slightly lame. Yet are not the best of us servants in the church, and the highest of us servants of the people and the state? To be a slattern in a vulgar household is scarcely an elevated employment, but neither is working in a sweatshop or belonging to a calling that is really degraded, which is otherwise about all that equal lack of ability would procure. On the other hand, consider the vocation of a lady's maid or courier valet, and compare the advantages these enjoy, to say nothing of their never having to worry about overhead expenses, with the opportunities of those who have never been out of the factory or the store, or further away than the adjoining town in their lives. As for a nurse, is there any vocation more honorable? No character in E.F. Benson's Our Family Affairs is more beautiful or more tenderly drawn than that of Beth, who was not only nurse to the children of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but one of the most dearly beloved of the family's members. Her place was absolutely next to their mother's, in the very heart of the household always. 2 years ago, Anna, who had for a lifetime been Mrs. Gilding's personal maid, died. Every engagement of that seemingly frivolous family was cancelled, even the invitations for their ball. Not one of the family but mourned for what she truly was, their humble but nearest friend. Would it have been so much better, so much more dignified, for these two women who lived long, useful years in closest association with every cultivating influence of life, to have lived on in their native villages and worked in a factory, or to have had a little store of their own? Does this false idea of dignity, since it is false, go so far as that? How many servants for correct service? It stands to reason that one may expect more perfect service from a specialist than from one whose functions are multiple. But small houses that have a double equipment, meaning an alternate who can go in the kitchen and two for the dining room, can be every bit as well run, so far as essentials go, as the palaces of the Gildings and the Worldlies, though of course not with the same impressiveness. But good service is badly handicapped if, when the waitress goes out, there is no one to open the door, or when the cook goes out, there is no one to prepare a meal. For what one might call complete service, meaning service that is adequate for constant entertaining and can stand comparison with the most luxurious establishments, 3 are the minimum: a cook, a butler or waitress, and a housemaid. The reason why luncheons and dinners cannot be perfectly given with a waitress alone is because 2 persons are necessary for the exactions of modern standards of service. Yet one alone can, on occasion, manage very well if attention is paid to ordering an especial menu for single-handed service, described on page 233. Aside from the convenience of a second person in the dining room, a house cannot be run very comfortably and smoothly without alternating shifts in staying in and going out, the waitress being on duty to answer bell and telephone and serve tea one afternoon, and the housemaid taking her place the next. They also alternate in going out every other evening after dinner. It should be realized that above the number necessary for essentials, each additional chambermaid, parlor maid, footman, scullery maid, or useful man is made necessary by the size of the house and by the amount of entertaining usual, rather than, as is often supposed, for the mere reason of show. The seemingly superfluous number of footmen at Golden Hall and Great Estate are, aside from standing on parade at formal parties, needed actually to do the immense amount of work that houses of such size entail, whereas a small apartment can be fairly well looked after by one alone. All house employees and details of their several duties, manners, and appearances are enumerated below. Beginning with the greatest and most complicated establishments possible, the employee of highest rank is the secretary, who is also companion. The position of companion, which is always one of social equality with her employer, exists only when the lady of the house is an invalid, or very elderly, or a widow, or a young girl. In the latter case, the companion is a chaperone. Her secretarial duties consist in writing impersonal letters and notes, and probably paying bills. She may have occasional invitations to send out and to answer, though a lady needing a companion is not apt to be greatly interested in social activities. The companion never performs the services of a maid, but she occasionally does the housekeeping. Otherwise her duties cannot very well be set down, because they vary with individual requirements. One lady likes continually to travel and merely wants a companion, usually a poor relative or friend, to go with her. Another, who is a semi-invalid, never leaves her room, and the duties of her companion are almost those of a trained nurse. The average requirement is in being personally agreeable, tactful, intelligent, and companionable. A companion dresses as any other lady does, according to the occasion, her personal taste, her age, and her means. Varied social standing of the private secretary. The private secretary to a diplomat, since he must first pass the diplomatic examination in order to qualify, is invariably a young man of education, if not of birth, and his social position is always that of a member of his chief's family. The position of an ordinary private secretary is sometimes that of an upper servant. Or, on the other hand, his own social position may be much higher than that of his employer. A secretary who either has position of his own or is given position by his employer is in every way treated as a member of the family. He is present at all general entertainments, and quite as often as not at lunches and dinners. The duties of a private secretary are naturally to attend to all correspondence, take shorthand notes of speeches or conversations, file papers and documents, and in every way serve as extra eyes and hands and supplementary brain for his employer. The social secretary. The position of social secretary is an entirely clerical one, and never confers any social privileges, unless the secretary is also companion. Her duties are to write all invitations, acceptances, and regrets, keep a record of every invitation received and every one sent out, and to enter in an engagement book every engagement made for her employer, whether to lunch, dinner, to be fitted, or go to the dentist. She also writes all impersonal notes, takes longer letters in shorthand, and writes others herself after being told their purport. She also audits all bills and draws the checks for them. The checks are filled in and then presented to her employer to be signed, after which they are put in their envelopes, sealed, and sent. When the receipted bills are returned, the secretary files them according to her own method, where they can at any time be found by her if needed for reference. In many cases it is she, though it is most often the butler, who telephones invitations and other messages. Occasionally, a social secretary is also a social manager, devises entertainments, and arranges all details, such as the decorations of the house for a dance, or a program of entertainment following a very large dinner. The social secretary very rarely lives in the house of her employer. More often than not, she goes also to one or two other houses, since there is seldom work enough in one to require her whole time. Miss Brisk, who is Mrs. Gilding's secretary, has little time for anyone else. She goes every day for from 2 to sometimes 8 or 9 hours in town, and at Golden Hall lives in the house. Usually a secretary can finish all there is to do in an average establishment in about an hour, or at most 2 a day, with the addition of 5 or 6 hours on 2 or 3 other days each month for the paying of bills. Supposing she takes 3 positions, she goes to Mrs. A from 8:30 to 10 every day, and for 3 extra hours on the 10th and 11th of every month. To Mrs. B from 10:30 to 1, her needs being greater, and for 6 extra hours on the 12th, 13th, and 14th of every month. And to Mrs. C every day at 3 o'clock, for an indefinite time of several hours or only a few minutes. Her dress is that of any business woman. Conspicuous clothes are out of keeping, as they would be out of keeping in an office, which, however, is no reason why she should not be well dressed. Well-cut, tailor-made suits are the most appropriate, with a good-looking but simple hat, as good shoes as she can possibly afford, and good gloves, and immaculately clean shirt-waists represent about the most dignified and practical clothes. But why describe clothes? Every woman with good sense enough to qualify as a secretary has undoubtedly sense enough to dress with dignity. And before we leap into the servants of the household, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Etiquette by Emily Post. Once again, we've learned so much. Who knew there was a script for answering an invitation on the telephone? So useful. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this classic work for yourself and see the many, many models of invitations it includes, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.